Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is the 11th episode of the Auspicious Elections podcast. Joining me today is Lisa Scheim. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Chris.
And today is, Saturday, October 28th, 2017, starting at 2:53 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. As I said, this is the 11th episode of the show, and we've got a nice Aquarius rising chart as we're getting started today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you some auspicious electional charts. We've picked out every month on this show, we pick out 4 auspicious electional charts that are useful for general purposes for initiating different types of actions, especially new beginnings and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So our primary focus in each of these charts is making sure that the ruler of the ascendant and the moon are well placed in each chart so that they can act as good general purpose electional charts. And then there's certain charts that are going to be better or worse for different types of ventures depending on other placements, which we'll specify as we go through the charts. So what you need to do with each of these charts, just to reiterate from past episodes or to get this out of the way, is you just need to take the date and the time that we've given you, apply it directly to your location. So recast the chart in your location for the same time. So each of these charts uses local time, which means that you should be able to use approximately the same time in your time zone without converting it. And you should get roughly the same rising sign. So if you don't, what you need to do is you need to adjust the chart or adjust the time until the same rising sign and the same rising degree as we gave in the chart is there. All right, so are there any other preliminary things that we need to get out of the way before we get into November?
We could kind of recap anything we've noticed over the past month. One of the things I had noticed is, so people who've been listening for a little bit will know that once in a while, we will put the ascendant ruler in a cadent house, which is not ideal, like the 3rd house or the 6th house or 9th or not so often 12th, but those are the cadent ones. As long as you can mitigate it by putting the ascendant ruler configured to the midheaven degree, sometimes that'll be good enough if you can't get a better chart with like the ascendant ruler in an angular house or something more positive. And just something I had noticed over the past month is I had a couple things I did with the ascendant ruler in the 6th, and it was still mitigated with the midheaven, but something was still, in each case, there was something still a little off about what, the action I took afterwards and how it went. And so that was just interesting to notice because, the ascendant ruler in the 6th is never ideal, but you kind of try to make it as good as possible. So it was just interesting to see how a few of those played out in a row.
Sure. So you're saying that some of the ones with the ruler of the ascendant and the 12th didn't still work out that well, even though they were somewhat mitigated?
In the 6th, I actually really tried to avoid the ascendant ruler in the 12th, but the ascendant ruler in the 6th is still cadent, and I did a few of those. And it wasn't like terrible. I think it was just a good example of kind of how almost what you would expect, but just like a few real life instances of it wasn't terrible, but there was something off about it. So
sure.
We usually use that if we can't get a better one. So it was a good example of how those go sometimes.
Right. Let me just adjust my camera because I have to remember to look at the camera when I'm talking. Let's see. All right. Are there other preliminary things we want to get away? I mean, I didn't really have anything last month. The only, interesting things we already talked about that were recently were in that, in the forecast episode where we talked about, I think you and I both separately at the same time noticed it was interesting that the JFK files were being released on the Sun-Jupiter conjunction that day. Mm-hmm. Although that actually ended up being interesting because then they ended up not actually releasing all of the files. So right. The Sun, Jupiter being completely under the beams of the Sun, while there was a release of there was some disclosure, it still ended up being partially still eclipsed in some sense. And that was actually kind of interesting because Austin noted that we're in a period where it's going to be a while before Venus has just entered under the beams of the Sun, and it's not going to emerge for several more months. And supposedly some of the files are going to be released early next year.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, even just the sign significations, the Sun Jupiter conjunction in Scorpio coinciding with that, but Scorpio, of course, pertaining to the topic of the files that were being released, but also even the, sort of struggle over what should still be kept secret, with that Sun Jupiter conjunction in the sign of Scorpio.
Right. Yeah, definitely. All right. Let's see. The other thing, I mean, I wanted to mention something about, in defense of using electional charts as all purpose elections, because I sometimes get crap from this from some of the Renaissance astrologers who say you have to also pay attention to the natal chart, which kind of, to me, goes without saying a little bit that the natal chart has to be taken into account as the final deciding factor. But that's almost like a separate thing. To me, that's natal astrology, like looking at the transits to a person's chart on a specific date is basically just using transits and using natal astrology and the timing technique of transits. So what we're doing here, though, is looking at electional astrology as a sort of thing unto itself, which is what does it take to find a good standalone chart that in and of itself, if it was going to represent the chart for a business or the chart for a marriage or the chart for a major journey or something like that, what is the most ideal chart that you would like to shoot for the sort of birth or the commencement of that entity unto itself. So that's primarily what we're focused on here in terms of electional astrology, is finding the 4 best electional charts that we can find each month. And then, of course, separately, you're supposed to eventually check those charts and make sure that they don't look terrible in terms of your own personal natal chart, since obviously if they do, then it might not be an electional chart that you want to use, but instead you might want to use a different electional chart during that same time frame that would fit your own natal chart better.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, both are important.
Sure. All right. Any other preliminary stuff before we jump into the first election?
As far as rising signs, those listening or watching here will notice that I've gone a little crazy with the Aquarius rising charts this month, and that is in part because, well, they happen to be, some of the best possible charts this month, but also Aquarius is still pretty good with Saturn ruling it in the 11th house in Sagittarius, which is a good house, and Saturn's going to switch signs mid-December into Capricorn, so then you'll have Aquarius rising with Saturn in the 12th. And so you won't be able to get nearly as good Aquarius rising charts in the near future. So this is kind of like the last hurrah of those.
Right. And the really big deal, of course, compared to last month is that Mars has finally left Virgo. So it's no longer forming or no longer has that superior square over Saturn, which was causing us so much problems during some of the past month or two of trying to use Aquarius rising and trying to make Saturn the ruler of the ascendant, because that's normally one of our automatic disqualifying conditions, as if the most difficult planet in the chart is afflicting the ruler of the ascendant or the moon, then usually that's just a no-go and you don't use that chart. But we were sort of put in a weird position during some of those time frames where we still had to go with the Aquarius rising charts in some instances because it was the least bad of a series of bad options.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And that was a little frustrating. So it is definitely very nice that Mars has moved on now and is not afflicting Saturn anymore.
Right. The only thing that has changed now that's a little bit unfortunate is now we don't have Jupiter. Over the past year, it had been going through Libra, and it had been, for the most part, oftentimes forming at different points a pretty close sextile with Saturn in Sagittarius with reception, since Saturn was in Jupiter's domicile. So now Jupiter is in Scorpio, so it's completely in aversion to Saturn in Sagittarius and not aspecting it at all, which makes it sort of a step down from some of those charts that we had over the past year with Saturn in Sagittarius and Aquarius rising, but still, all things considered, pretty good.
Yeah, definitely. That was kind of a nice deal that those were set up that way for such a while. But yeah, we don't have that anymore for the next month.
Sure. All right. Well, let's jump into the first chart then.
Okay.
So I'm gonna, for those watching the video version of this, I'm gonna pull up the chart on the screen so that you can follow it as we're talking. All right, there we go. So the data for the first chart is November 9th, 2017, starting at approximately 12:23 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, with about 6 degrees of Aquarius rising.
Mm-hmm. And this is the chart that I believe was featured on the monthly forecast, right?
Yeah, this was the
Yeah.
one that we ended up featuring as like the most auspicious chart we could find for the month.
Mm-hmm. This one I feel like is the most stable of all the possibilities in November. So with this one, you have Aquarius rising with Saturn ruling the ascendant in Sagittarius in the 11th, as we were talking about before. The moon is in early Leo in 7th house, and it's applying to a trine with Mercury first in Sagittarius in the 11th, and then very soon after that, a square with Jupiter in Scorpio in the 10th house. And you've got both benefics, Venus and Jupiter in Scorpio in the 10th house. So they're very prominent up there. This is a day chart. So Saturn ruling the ascendant is the more constructive kind of Saturn. And as we mentioned earlier, Mars is no longer in Virgo overcoming Saturn. Instead, it's in Libra in the 9th house there. So it's just a sextile, which is fine. Yeah, so those are some of the main features of this chart. The moon's in an, excuse me, in an angular house. Both benefics are in the 10th house, very prominent. And at the specific time here, Jupiter is square the ascendant degree as well.
Right. So part of the purpose of the exact sign of the exact time with 6 degrees of Aquarius rising is to make Jupiter more angular or more pivotal in the chart by making it exactly square to the ascendant descendant axis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And since Venus is only a few degrees before that, they're both pretty angular in terms of both being in an angular house by whole sign houses and being square the ascendant degree.
Sure. So one of the things this chart does really well then is it really emphasizes that Venus Jupiter conjunction right there in the middle or right at the top of the chart at 2 degrees and 6 degrees of Scorpio, which is still applying, and Venus is moving pretty fast at this point towards its conjunction with Jupiter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let's see what else about this chart. I wasn't really intending on the moon Mercury. It does hit Mercury first before Jupiter, and I was trying for Jupiter, but doesn't quite make it with Aquarius rising. But you kind of get the benefits of both. You know, it's kind of good for communicative things since it is a moon trine Mercury election, but it's also pretty close to the degree of Jupiter. So you've got that following very soon after. So just the general benefic of the sect, since Jupiter is the better benefic planet in daytime charts, is being highlighted.
Right. It would be, we talked about in this forecast that it would be nicer if it was just the moon was separating from Venus and applying directly to Jupiter. And it's almost unfortunate that Mercury intercedes because it breaks up the benefic enclosure. But, you know, all things considered, that's still a pretty awesome enclosure between the moon being between both benefics. And then the fact that it's actually applying to Mercury is a pretty positive flowing aspect for the moon to have into fire signs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, this is a pretty good all-purpose election, and I'm trying to think what it might not be good for. You might not want to use it if you were specifically trying to use it for like long-distance travel with Mars in the 9th house, or like higher education matters, applying to a university, things like that. But otherwise, it's pretty good.
Right. So the area of potential difficulties is the 9th house and things like foreigners or foreign travel or education, just because Mars is in a day chart in the 9th. One of the positive things that the chart does have going for it, though, is it does have a exchange of signs between Venus and Mars, which I do feel like helps to take a little bit of the edge off of the fact that both of them are in the sign of their detriment, or the sign of, whatever you want to call that. I came up with different names for it in the Hellenistic book. And that actually became one of our discussions this month, was just the concept of detriment and the concept of a planet being thrust into a situation where it has to act in a way that's pretty much the opposite of how it usually tends to act, or how it's usually predisposed towards acting. And that when it's thrown into that sort of situation, it's sometimes not as effective or not as good at sort of pretending to play the opposite role than it's used to, or than it would otherwise if it was in its own domicile or exaltation or something like that. But I think in these instances where you have Venus and Mars both exchanging signs, that it does give them something like a temporary form of dignity through a sort of loose mutual reception. And especially with Venus applying to Jupiter, that's kind of reinforced, because you have that affirmation from Jupiter that Venus is sort of doing a good job, or is at least capable of doing a good job, and is receiving support from Jupiter in order to be as effective as it possibly can while moving through Scorpio.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good way of describing it. And if you're doing elections this month, I mean, you kind of can't get away from Venus being in Scorpio and not having great dignity and so forth. And so you just kind of have to work with, the best possible arrangements of those planets. So this is one of them.
Yeah, well, and the thing about this is probably one of the best case scenarios for Venus and Scorpio. So whatever the best possible, since there's going to be a range of different positive and negative manifestations, or a spectrum of different, from like best to worst case manifestations of a planet in any position, this is going to be like some of the best case scenarios for Venus being in Scorpio during this time, especially while in this, or the earlier part of the month, when it's still applying very closely to Jupiter.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And we do have 2 time alternatives for this day, for at least some time zones. So if this one doesn't work out, then we also have like a later time.
What is the later time?
So that one is at, sorry, my screen is, 1 second. Okay, so the later time is at 4:12 p.m. And so that one is Taurus rising. And so this one, while it won't work out for every time zone because the moon is so close to applying to Jupiter now, some people might want to use it, because if you're really trying for the moon Jupiter specifically, rather than the moon applying to Mercury first, you can do this later, at least in the east coast of the US and central and mountain. I think the west coast, it may be past. But so this one, you have kind of like different pros and cons. So this one's Taurus rising. So then you've got Venus ruling the ascendant in Scorpio. And so we were just talking about that dignity issue. And on the one hand, then you have Venus not in great dignity ruling the ascendant, rather than just being in the configuration. But then you also, on the flip side, have the ascendant ruler applying directly to a conjunction with Jupiter, which is still a day chart here. And then you also have the moon now past Mercury and also applying to Jupiter by square. So this is another alternative, potentially, some people might want to use.
Yeah, and so this would really just even emphasize even more Venus by making it the ruler of the ascendant. And so if you're looking for something that had that sort of dark aesthetic, and I know like Austin and Kelly and I came up with a bunch of different keywords for Venus and Scorpio, if that was what you were shooting for in your election, or if there was something about your election where that was a good idea or necessary or desirable, then this would be the chart to shoot for, especially if it's like a 7th house type election that involves partnership or other people or relationships or things like that, because this is a chart where with the ruler of the ascendant in the seventh house with Jupiter, it's very much focused on that specific sphere of activity.
Right. Yeah, so you could go for either the ascendant ruler in the 11th house, which would be more focused on friends and groups and associations, or the ascendant ruler in the 7th house here with the later time.
Right. Just make sure. I mean, you don't necessarily have to. You could miss it, but ideally, in order to really use the selectional chart as you've set it up, you need to make sure that the moon is still applying to the square with Jupiter, because that's kind of a crucial part of making sure that the outcome of this chart is positive, is that the moon is still applying to a benefic. And if you miss that, like if you're in a time zone where the moon is already separating from Jupiter, it looks like the next application is to a square with the sun, which is not necessarily terrible, but it's not going to turn out, it's not necessarily going to be as auspicious as that applying aspect to Jupiter that we have here.
Right, definitely. And that's why, I try to be cautious with some of the close moon applications, because you do have to definitely double check then in your specific time zone to make sure that the moon is still applying to the planet that, we're trying for here in these elections. But then on the other hand, if it does work out in your time zone, then you've got a really nice close in degree moon Jupiter application, or whichever one we're trying for in that chart.
Right. And that's one that you can often see that we're shooting for in most of our electional charts, is that you'll see us shooting for a chart that has the ruler of the ascendant applying to a benefic ideally, and you'll see the moon ideally also applying to a benefic through some kind of aspect. So if you sort of go through a lot of our charts, you'll see that as one of the common sort of recurring factors, and this chart is unique because it has not just one of those, but both of those, with both the ruler of the ascendant and the moon applying to Jupiter.
Right, exactly. So I did want to throw this one in, even though it won't work for 100% of people, but if it does, it's a second chart that same day.
Right. Okay, that sounds good. So let's move on to the next chart. And
Okay.
why, one of the questions people might ask is, the first charts are set for November 9th. So why are they so late? Why are we already basically in like the second week of November before we have an electional chart?
I'm not sure if I can recollect why exactly the first week wasn't working out as well. I know that I had another possibility 2 days earlier with the moon in Cancer in its own sign, but then you would have had to do Pisces rising. The thing with using Jupiter as the ruler of the ascendant, now that it's in Scorpio instead of Libra, is that then you have say you do it in a day chart, for instance, then you have a positive ascendant ruler, but then the ascendant ruler's ruler is not as positive. So before, with Jupiter in Libra, you'd have, say Jupiter ruling the ascendant and Venus ruling the ascendant ruler. And that is one of the things that can be good to pay attention to as well, not just the ascendant ruler itself, but the planet that rules that planet. And so for Pisces rising now, it on the one hand looks positive at first because you have Jupiter ruling the ascendant in a day chart in the 9th house, which is a decent house. But then that planet is ruled by Mars in a day chart, which is the kind of more problematic malefic during the day. And so you get it kind of offset, the positivity of Jupiter.
Right. And it looks like if you try to chart a day or two before November 9th, then you're going to have the moon in Cancer, which is going to be squaring Mars. Mm-hmm. And then if you try a day or two before that, you have the moon in Gemini, which is going to be opposing Saturn.
Right.
So this becomes one of the first days in November where the moon isn't making hard aspects with either of the malefics, and it's applying to at least one of the benefics.
Right. And I was trying for, a couple Taurus moons potentially, looking through the charts for this month before, because then you'd have, even though it would be an opposition, you'd have potentially the moon applying, opposite Venus and Jupiter both. But the rising signs, just sometimes when you try for elections with a factor like that, you can't always get it at the same time as like a positive rising sign and wherever the ascendant ruler is placed at the same time as the moon's still applying to those planets you're trying to get. So that was what was going on with, not having a nice moon in Taurus, even though Venus and Jupiter are both in a fixed sign.
Right. Okay. All right. So I think that does it for November 9th. And then after that, we've got a little bit of a gap of about another week until we get to the next electional chart.
Mm-hmm. So the next one is set for November 16th, around 12:01 p.m. And so this is another Aquarius rising chart. There's a bunch this month. Saturn is in the 11th again in Sagittarius in a day chart. And then in this one, the moon is in Scorpio. So this one is a little bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you've got moon applying to conjoin Jupiter in a day chart, which is normally very positive. It's still got Venus up there with it, just a few degrees past Jupiter in the same sign. So normally Moon-Jupiter conjunctions are great for electional charts. On the other hand, the moon is in Scorpio, and so it's not got great dignity joining Venus and not great dignity. So you got both of those. So in terms of planetary dignity, these two are not so good. But then on the other hand, you do have the moon right there with both Jupiter and Venus.
Right. I mean, we've got basically a year now of Jupiter moving through Scorpio, and so we've got to get used to making some concessions sometimes in terms of zodiacal strength versus the auspiciousness of aspects or certain types of configurations.
Right.
And, one of the things you have to acknowledge or say just from the outset is like not all dignified or poorly dignified planets that are in the sign of their detriment or their fall are not always completely bad. There's like positive manifestations of those placements, especially if there's positive things that are mitigating or are altering the placement. So the moon in Scorpio, for example, is traditionally not seen as its best or the place where it has the most strength due to zodiacal dignity. But in a situation like this, where the moon is applying within 3 degrees to a conjunction with Jupiter and then a conjunction with Venus, you're going to get the best or one of the best possible manifestations in terms of the possible manifestations of that placement. So all things considered, this is like best case scenario in terms of that, and is going to draw out some of those Scorpio placements in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, this is a nice, moon, Jupiter, Venus in the 10th house, very prominent. Mars is still in Libra, so it's still doing that offset of exchanging signs with Venus and Scorpio, with all the Scorpio planets ruler. And I'm trying to see anything else. Jupiter is square the ascendant degree fairly closely in this election. And I think those are the main things about this chart.
Sure. And then just going back to the dignity thing, the other thing that's relevant is just because a planet doesn't do something as effectively as it could, or doesn't do something in a way that's completely fitting with the way that it would normally go about expressing its significations, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be successful in what it's trying to do.
Right.
I think that's the basic difference here, is that the moon in Scorpio manifests itself in a weird way, but if it's applying to a conjunction with Jupiter and Venus, it's still going to be successful in what it's trying to accomplish. And if this is the chart for you trying to initiate an activity that you want to be successful, then this is going to be sort of one of your best shots in terms of having a favorable outcome for what you're trying to produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And especially during this month, if the activity is kind of time limited to needing to do it this month. You could also check, going back to the discussion of the electional chart, standalone chart versus the natal chart transits, you could see, where in particular Jupiter is transiting in your own chart. And that might, make it a particularly good area for you to use this for.
Right, because if you're somebody that has 8 degrees of Scorpio rising and Jupiter in Scorpio natally, and so you have Jupiter here, you have a moon Jupiter Venus conjunction on your ascendant and on the degree of your natal Jupiter, then that is going to be highly auspicious for you. And this would be a chart that both from an electional standpoint in terms of having a clustering of the benefics, and then also from a natal standpoint in terms of emphasizing your own chart positively, would be helpful and supportive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So do pay attention to both and see where that might best be used, potentially.
Sure. All right. Any other points about this chart before we move on?
Mars is getting a bit close to squaring Pluto, if that is something you want to take into account. Mars is almost 16 Libra, and Pluto at this point is about 17 and a half Capricorn. So you could have a little bit of kind of power struggly kind of feel from something involved in this, even though the overall election is positive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's getting close, and then we're actually coming off of a Mercury-Neptune square, which would have gone exact sometime in the previous week. It's still within 4 degrees, so it's still somewhat close, but at least it's separating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think those are the only two other major pieces of this chart going on.
Okay. All right. And then moving forward, the next chart is only a few days later.
Mm-hmm. So the next one, November 23rd, around 4:03 p.m. And so this is another Taurus rising chart, like the alternative chart for November 9th. So you'll notice the fixed signs are the major commonality between all the elections this month. It's either Aquarius rising or Taurus rising, and that's because it does sort of uniquely put both Jupiter and Venus in an angular house during this time frame. So this is late Taurus rising, Venus in Scorpio.
We should probably mention the specific degree for those people that are just listening.
Yeah, thank you. So around this one at 4:03 p.m. lands around 22 degrees Taurus rising. And that puts Venus in Scorpio close to the descendant in the 7th house. And it's with Jupiter also in Scorpio in the 7th. The sun has moved on to just very early Sagittarius, so this is still a day chart. So Jupiter is angular in a day chart. The moon has just ingressed into Aquarius in the 10th whole sign house, and it's applying closely, very closely, to a sextile with the sun first in Sagittarius, and then it will go on after that to square Jupiter. You can't get, at least in the time zones, all the time zones I checked, Taurus rising didn't coincide with the moon directly applying to Jupiter. It might in some, but the few that I checked, it was still applying to the sun the whole time. But that's still pretty good. You know, this is a waxing moon, so moon sextile sun is good, and then also square by sign Jupiter and Venus, and not too far after by degree, about 8 degrees after is Jupiter. So, yeah, what else do you see to talk about?
So, I mean, one of the things is that the ascendant is so late in the sign, and what the rationale is for that, because it makes Venus and Jupiter less angular just by quadrant or by degrees.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember, you know, I think part of it was that if you do it late like this, then if you can get the midheaven into Aquarius rather than Capricorn, you do two things by doing that. You put the sun sextile the degree of the midheaven, and the sun is in the 8th house here, and so it mitigates that 8th house placement, which is otherwise not as favorable, but that makes it a little bit more prominent. And then it also, let's see, what was the other thing? Oh yeah, when the midheaven otherwise is in Capricorn, then you have Mars in an overcoming square from Libra, and it's still a day chart, so it is better, if you can do it, to put the midheaven into Aquarius instead.
Right. It seems like that was the big thing that you were trying to avoid, was having the degree of the midheaven squaring Mars and conjoining Pluto at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was that, and then also the sextile of the sun was kind of a nice added benefit.
Sure. So depending on other people's locations, it's like if you can get the midheaven in Aquarius, but make it so that earlier Taurus is rising, so that the descendant is closer to Venus or closer to Jupiter, then go ahead and do it. But if you have to make the midheaven square Mars in order to accomplish that, then it's better to put the ascendant later in Taurus and
Hmm.
avoid having the midheaven square Mars.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure I would have put Jupiter on the descendant otherwise in a day chart and make that, exactly angular, but this seemed better.
Yeah, definitely. And part of that general philosophy is just what we're trying to do in most of these charts is emphasize the benefics as much as possible and downplay or de-emphasize the prominence of the malefics in the chart. So in this chart, we have Mars cadent in the sixth house, not making a major hard aspect to any other traditional planets in the chart, and generally out of the way. So um, that would be different if the midheaven was closely square Mars, because that would bring it into greater prominence in the chart.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And those are two major things that are kind of like primary factors in every chart. Um, Trying to think if there's anything else in this one. It's just kind of nice that this one does have the waxing moon in terms of the lunar cycle, in addition to it being square Venus and Jupiter by sign.
Right. So we finally got a waxing moon, which is better for growth and expansion and building things up, versus the waning moon, which is usually better for bringing things to maturity or sometimes breaking things down or wrapping them up.
Hmm. Yeah. And, in a kind of less exact kind of way, the moon going into Sagittarius might lighten the feel or the mood of this a little bit, because before we had, the Sun, Venus, and Jupiter all in Scorpio, which can be a little bit more of a darker, a sober kind of feel. And then one of them also had the moon in Scorpio. So this finally lightens it a little bit by getting the Sun into a fire sign.
Right. Definitely. All right. That looks good to me. I'm not sure if there's anything else for to be mentioned for that chart.
I think those are most of the major factors.
Okay. And this one is basically very similar to the other Taurus rising chart, except here Venus is later in Scorpio, no longer applying to Jupiter. So there's a little bit of a trade-off here in terms of the earlier chart in some ways is almost the better version of this because it has Venus still applying to the conjunction with Jupiter.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think so. I like the November 9th charts, both of them. Even though they are waning moons, but yeah, you still have the Venus applying to Jupiter, which is better.
Right. Okay, sounds good. So the final chart takes place just 3 days later.
Hmm. And so this one is again Aquarius rising to round the entire month out of Aquarius rising charts. So Saturn ruling the ascendant in the 11th in Sagittarius. The moon in this one is in early Pisces, and it's applying to a trine with Jupiter in the 10th. And this one I would say is a little bit less good, but if you need something in the very late part of the month, it's still a good chart. Um, you do have a waxing moon, you have moon trine Jupiter. I guess the major thing is that the moon is in a succeedant house, which isn't quite as prominent, but it's also not, bad per se either, just not quite as good. Um, in this chart, if you can get it, I did put the midheaven just barely into Sagittarius. And so if you wanted to really emphasize mitigating the moon not being in an angular house, you could put ascendant even a little later and get the moon like exactly square the midheaven or something like that. But the moon trine Jupiter is also with reception, which is lovely since the moon is in Pisces and Jupiter rules Pisces. And once again, you still have Jupiter and Venus in an angular house in the 10th house again in this time. And finally, with this particular chart, the ascendant is 10 degrees Aquarius rising. So you've got Jupiter square the ascendant degree as well.
Right. So another one that's really emphasizing that day chart Jupiter in the 10th house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And One of the things once we get into this time period that we should probably mention, because I know we got almost in a little bit of trouble last time we had a Mercury retrograde, is that this chart is getting pretty close to Mercury stationing retrograde. It's about 6.5 days away from Mercury stationing retrograde at 29 degrees of Sagittarius. So it's well within the shadow period. And so you'll basically, shortly after this chart begins, you'll move directly into a retrograde period. And so this chart already kind of has some of that stamped or built right into it.
Yeah, that's true, and that's a good point. And I think we've said this before. A Mercury retrograde or shadow period Mercury is not the end of the world, particularly if it's not very pivotal in the chart. It's not ruling the ascendant or the moon or things like that, or the particular topic you're trying for, I guess. If Mercury is not ruling those houses, which in this case would be the fifth house and the eighth house. But it is, kind of an indication for at least the possibility that it might, say, using an election like this where Mercury was in its shadow period, might still overall be positive if it's a positive electional chart, but that you might need to redo things. There might be a process of kind of going back and, over a second time with some of the matters associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's going to be a Mercury retrograde period and you have to do something anyways, then it's like this is the best chart that we can find during that time frame. That doesn't mean that it's not potentially going to be subject to some of those issues once Mercury stations retrograde, and you might have to just anticipate the potential of some revisions or some things going awry, which you then have to account for or have to expend additional energy in order to sort of clean up.
Right. Yeah. And, it's good to expect that ahead of time, potentially, or at least the possibility of that. It's also a reminder that, you can't control everything using electional astrology. You can do the best you can within a certain time period and what the planets are doing during that time period. And it still might, go better than otherwise if you use this versus like an inauspicious chart. But that doesn't mean you can control all of the factors.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But all of that being said, like all things considered, this is still a good chart for the end of the month and an auspicious electional chart with the moon applying to a trine with Jupiter, with reception, the ruler of the ascendant, well placed, basically is almost as well placed of a Saturn as you can get, in a good house, in a relatively good sign, in a day chart, and everything else. So it's a pretty sturdy electional chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the only real, I wouldn't even stress too much about the Mercury. The only potential thing I would say as a downside is that Mars is getting somewhat close to opposing that Uranus. So it's within 3 degrees at this point. So there could be some, unexpected action surrounding that.
Right. Yeah. All right. Any other major points about our last electional chart?
I mean, there's a pretty close Mercury-Saturn conjunction, but it's a day chart, like we said, so it's a more constructive Saturn. So I actually think that could play out as even a positive, depending on what you were trying to do with the election.
Yeah, one of the things that comes up in a lot of the Hellenistic texts that's somewhat surprising at first is that they often treat Mercury as like an amplifying or a magnifying significator when it's conjoining other planets. And so if it's like a good thing, then if it's a positive indication, then it's amplifying the positive things. If it's a negative indication, then it's amplifying the negative things. But here, since that's the ruler of the ascendant and it's in a day chart, so that Saturn is going to express its more constructive significations, I think that's just going to amplify whatever positive things you're attempting to accomplish, especially if it's within the sphere of some sort of 11th house type activity.
Right. Yeah. And as you mentioned, the Mercury is going retrograde fairly soon after this. So it will go back over the Saturn. So that kind of even ties in more to what you were just saying, which is kind of emphasizing that Saturn in the 11th in a day chart placement.
Right. And if you have natal degrees around those placements, especially if that's positive, then it could potentially emphasize and re-emphasize those more.
Mm-hmm.
All
Yeah.
right. That sounds good. So, and that's our last electional chart for November.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any final thoughts on November or anything else before we wrap up?
Um, it's interesting that during this time period, we have, let me just pull up the rising signs. So it's interesting noticing that you have several rising signs in a row during this time period where the ascendant ruler is in the 12th. You have Scorpio with Mars in Libra, then Sagittarius with Jupiter in Scorpio, and then finally Capricorn with Saturn in Sagittarius. So that was just kind of unique in that that doesn't usually play out that way. You don't.
So I'm pulling up the charts really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say mid-November. What was the first one you mentioned?
So it
So if
was
it's Scorpio
Scorpio.
rising,
Mm-hmm.
so if it's Scorpio rising, then we have Scorpio ascendant, and the traditional ruler of Scorpio is Mars, which is going through Libra all month. So the ruler of the ascendant would be in the 12th, which is typically something we'd want to avoid.
Mm-hmm. And then after that, then Sagittarius rising is ruled by Jupiter, which is in Scorpio in the 12th.
Right. So that's going to be that's pretty much all year we're going to be
Yeah.
dealing with that. And any time we want to use a Sagittarius rising chart, it's automatically going to put Jupiter in the 12th house, which is not great. And typically we're probably going to be wanting to avoid it. Although I can anticipate already that there's probably going to be some months in the future where we're going to be trying to figure out how to mitigate that in order to make it a usable electional chart, even though it's definitely not ideal.
Right. And that was part of my being a little bit sad that Jupiter was leaving Libra and going into Scorpio, bless you, is that the arrangements of the ascendant and the ascendant rulers gets a little bit wonky with some of these rising signs.
Right. And so the last one was Capricorn rising.
Capricorn with Saturn in Sagittarius, then in the 12th house again. So, and it's just unique that you would have three rising signs in a row that were doing that exact same thing that you don't really want in a chart, ideally.
Right. Although thankfully for that one, this is basically the last month that we'll be dealing with that because Saturn's going to ingress into Capricorn here pretty soon. So we're actually going to start a long 2 or 3 year period of having Saturn going through its own sign and being able to do some Saturn type elections as a result of that, and placing Saturn in the first house.
Yeah, yeah. Everyone should get ready for like a swarm of really strong Saturn elections, Saturn being in its own sign in Capricorn, and that being the case for the next few years.
Right. If you thought the Aquarius rising charts were too numerous over the past year or two, then you haven't seen anything yet.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But thankfully, at least with this span of three rising signs in a row, that two of them are going to be knocked out within like a month or so. So Scorpio rising won't have the ruler in the 12th for, too much longer. And then same with Capricorn rising.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. And the last thing I actually forgot to mention, maybe you did mention already, is we did talk about it in the forecast, how especially early in the month, we have that really tight Saturn-Uranus trine, which is actually a really positive thing that's built into then all of these Aquarius rising charts where Saturn's the ruler of the ascendant, is that sort of innovative trine from Uranus as something that would then characterize the electional chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'd noticed it, but I hadn't talked about it. Yeah, they're quite close in degree. So you have kind of a harmonious combination of stability and innovation or experimentation.
Right. So that would be a very good, that's a nice balance between those two things. So that should be another useful piece for all of these Aquarius rising charts in November.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, I think that's it then for this episode. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think that's a pretty good overview of the month of November.
All right, great. All right. Well, I think that's it then for the 11th episode of the Auspicious Elections podcast. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for supporting the astrology podcast on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it makes a huge difference. Yeah, and we will, let us know how these electional charts go. We always appreciate hearing feedback about what worked or what didn't work, sort of after the fact, once you've had a chance to put some of these charts into practice and actually see how the elections work out. So definitely comment on this post on Patreon or send us an email to let us know how it goes. And yeah, and I think that's it. So we'll see you all next month once we do the electional charts for December. All right, let's wrap it up.